something horrible arrived with the rain. I'm visiting my brother's cabin in Washington State. He let me come here after my divorce, get away from all the nonsense, and clear my head for a couple weeks. It's beautiful out here, the quaint little hut, exactly what I had been expecting. It's surrounded by dense forest, and you have to take a long dirt road to reach it. It's wonderful. Before I arrived, my brother informed me that he had stocked the hut with groceries, enough to last a month if I decided wanted to stay that long. He was leaving it up to me, knowing what hell my breakup had been. I had lost almost everything, and as a gesture of goodwill, he had extended a hand and offered his cabin to me. It was a welcome sanctuary, and upon arrival I found myself blissfully calm. The woods were alive with sound, the creak of wood, the gentle rustle of wind through the leaves, the chirp of birds in conversation. It was all so serene. The first couple days were wonderful, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. The horrible legal battle I had been engaged in with my wife had taken the wind out of my sails. But out here I let the warm breeze envelop me with new life and energy. To my surprise, it had been beautiful the first couple days, the gentle golden rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy of green overhead. The first 3 days I spent a lot of time walking through the woods, isolated from everything and everyone. I was alone out here, a stranger to the surrounding green kingdom. I let my mind wander free from the chains it had been bound with, my thoughts drifting towards what I would do with my new life. Possibilities began to blossom before me, and actually started discovering hope in my future again. I had heard on the news that a 7-day storm was headed my way, so it came as no surprise when the sky darkened. As a resident of Washington, I was no stranger to long bouts of rain, and this was no different. I had just finished eating dinner when the rain started, gentle pitter-patters on the roof that eventually evolved into a full-blown gale. I started a fire and pulled a chair up to the window, watching the storm. It was cozy, and I found peace in watching the chaos that I was protected from. And then I heard something on the roof. I cocked my ear to listen, the small cabin lit only by the glow of the fireplace. At first I thought it was just the rain, but after a few moments, I realized it sounded like someone was running around up there. I didn't know what to make of it, assuming it had to be some kind of animal, but it sounded much bigger. I grabbed the blanket off of the chair I was sitting in and pulled it up to my chin, creeped out by the noise. Oh, after a little bit, the sound stopped. My heart was in my throat and my eyes darted to the front door. Thunder boomed overhead, and I suddenly felt incredibly far away from civilization. I shivered despite the fire and turned my eyes to look out the window I was sitting in front of. Lightning flashed, and I suddenly leaned forward, heart racing. Something wasn't right out there. I thought my eyes had to be playing tricks on me, and I anxiously waited for more lightning. I forced myself to calm down, sure that what Till had just seen was paranoia brought on by fear. The world was illuminated once again by a bright blast of lightning, and my eyes went wide. Mere feet from the window, the rain seemed to bend around the shapes of 3 invisible figures. They stood about 6 feet tall, the rain outlining their still forms. I swallowed hard, waiting for another blast of lightning, and when it came, the shapes remained. They were immobile, and I suddenly felt eyes on me, as if they had come with the storm to watch me. I retreated from the window, feeling exposed and afraid, and went and sat on my bed. I was terrified, so shaken by the bizarre forms that I began to have a hard time breathing. Just as I was about to get back up, I heard something walking on the roof again. I gripped the sides of my bed as I listened to the heavy footsteps walk closer, and then finally stop directly over my head. I crawled between my covers and held my breath, eyes wide in a panic. What the hell was out there? Another flash of lightning lit the sky, and I glanced at the window. It was right there, its invisible form parting the rain like a curtain. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the covers over my head. I heard myself whimpering and slapped a hand over my mouth. What were these things? What did they want? And then a thought slammed into me with the force of a locomotive. Where was the third one? And that's when I heard the front door crash open. I cried out in fear, shaking like a child as heavy, wet footsteps walked across the cabin towards me. It stopped by the side of my bed, and I felt drops of water falling from its body onto my blanket. I could hear it breathing, a sucking sound pulled deep into its moist lungs. As I bawled into myself under the covers, terrified, it spoke. Its voice sounded like rain, an odd stuttered inflection of its vocal cords. I didn't move, didn't breathe, praying that this nightmare would end. I didn't know what these things were, what they wanted, but I sensed danger. I sensed they wanted to hurt me, and I sensed that if I looked at them, they could. I stayed balled up under my blankets and kept my trembling mouth shut. "Look at me," it repeated in the same wet voice, its words dribbling from its mouth like running water. Again, I didn't move. I was absolutely paralyzed with fear. I kept my eyes closed and the blanket firmly over me. My stomach churned with terror and my breath was hot in the enclosed space. I don't know how long I waited. Eventually, I heard the thing retreat, slamming the door behind it. Even with it gone, I remained where I was, refusing to move. I listened to the rain crash down above me, the relentless storm never ceasing in its violence. I don't know if I fell asleep or passed out, but the next thing I remember was opening my eyes to dim gray light. I hesitantly pulled the blanket from me and surveyed the cabin. The fire had died out and the scene before me was still in the early morning light. The rain still thundered overhead as sheets of it were driven from the dark sky. I slowly got out of bed and went to the window. "Please, vertical bar," I muttered, voice cracking. The three figures stared back at me, the rain outlining their still figures. I dropped to the floor, out of sight, a hand to my chest. I crawled over to the small kitchen and reached up to retrieve my cell phone. I jumped to my feet, scouring the surface for where I knew I left it the previous night. It was gone, but a long, wet, dark smudge stained the wood, starting at the center and running to the edge. That thing had taken my phone. "What do you want from me?" I screamed. "What the fuck do you want from me?" The storm offered me no answer. "Leave me alone," whispered. "Just leave me alone, please. It's been 3 weeks. The storm hasn't ceased. I don't know what's happened. Something is seriously wrong. The sky remains a dim gray, the day-night cycle stuck in some horrific limbo. I don't think I'm ever getting out of this cabin. I'm almost out of food, and I wonder how long I can last before starvation drives me outside these walls. Oh, they're still there, the endless rain painting their figures in the air. They watch, always. They watch. When I hear one of them running across the roof, I sprint to my bed and bury myself under the covers. As soon as I do, another slams the front door open and comes to stand over me. It tells NM to look at it, commands me to look at it. Something about its voice has begun to sound familiar. The more it speaks to me, the more I have begun to recognize it. It sounds like me. It was a dark and stormy night. My dad used to tell me the same story again and again, in an attempt to scare me and my brother. We would rebel against the rules of, don't be outside later than 7:30. So he would use this exact story to terrify us into coming back before then. Looking back, it was probably one of the worst ways that he could have tried to get us to come back inside. However, that's besides the point. Recently, I called my dad to get him to tell me the story again, since I had forgotten what it was about, and only vaguely remembered a boy in a little yellow rain hat. My dad, gladly picking up the phone and telling me his story again, began once more. It was a dark and stormy night. Nostalgia flooded into my mind like the walls of a beaver's dam being destroyed. He continued to tell his story. Many memories came into my mind. I remembered the little boy and how he had been taken in the night because he didn't come home from playing in the rain all day. Though his disappearance made no sense in the story, my dad had always enjoyed telling this story and kept it as one of his most prized stories he had written. I asked, "Hey, didn't you say that this story was true and that you had heard from a friend that it had happened?" He replied, surprised that I had remembered. "Oh, yes. It's all true. My old friend told me many times that this was true and to be careful out at night past 7:30, otherwise you'd be taken." I had remembered the story behind why my dad took this so seriously and couldn't help but wonder why and how the kids would be taken. I never took these stories seriously, obviously, but was always wondering just a bit how they'd be taken. Asked, "How were they taken, Dad? Who or what took them?" He told me, "Well, that's the scary part. No one knows. I heard from a friend that children were taken by a man with disfigured face and disgusting eyes, but no one really knows." Puzzled, Lee wondered why anyone would think that this story was true. I said goodbye to my dad and thanked him for telling me the story again and resumed what Lee'd been doing prior to thinking about all of this. I had been cooking, making spaghetti for my wife, Mary, and our 2 children, Jacob and Sally. As the spaghetti finished cooking and was plated up, I called down to my family. "Dinner is ready." They came down in a hurry and all sat down at the table. "What did you make, Dad?" said a clearly hungry Jacob. "I made spaghetti, and you can't leave the table until you finish all of it. I don't want any repeats of last time." "Oh, but Dad, I want to go out and play with my friends." "Not until you're done your spaghetti. Now eat up." Dinner was over before we knew it, and Mary had gone back upstairs with Sally to go watch movies, while Jacob ran out the front door to go play with his friends. "Be back before 7:30, Jacob. You know what happens if you don't come back." As silly as I said the story was, I had actually used it night after night and told it to my children because I figured that if it worked for me and my brother, it would work for them too. "Yeah, Dad, I know. I'll be back at 7:20. "How's that?" "Sounds good, bud. See you then." Time passed, and I sat on our black couch in the living room, watching sports and being an overall tired, lazy mess. 7:20 came, and Jacob was still outside with his friends. I figured I'd let him stay an extra 5 minutes before I'd call him in. After waiting those 5 minutes, I called out to him with no reply. I felt a small, piercing feeling in my lungs as I began to think about the story my dad had told me. I didn't believe it. No big use. If it was true, there would be a report, right? I stepped outside to look for Jacob. It was 7:27 and getting dark. I went to the cul-de-sac near our house because that's where Jacob had been known to play from time to time. I got to the cul-de-sac to find it empty with a beat-up scooter leaning on the sidewalk. I immediately recognized it as Jacob's scooter and called out to him again. "Jacob, it's getting late. We need to go home." No reply. Worried, checked the time. 7:29. It was beginning to get really close to the time that I worried about. I looked into the forest adjacent to the cul-de-sac and figured maybe, just maybe, he would be in there with his friends. I ran into the forest and found small traces leading me to believe that he had been through here. I was on the right track. I followed the path, and that's when I heard one of the most blood-curdling screams that has stuck with me to this day. It was Jacob. I looked down at my watch, 7:30. The time had come, and I was growing more and more anxious by the second. There were sharp pains in my lungs like no other I've ever felt before. It felt like someone was shoving razor blades into my trachea. I collected myself and ran towards the screams. Even if he was screaming, there might still be time to save him. As I followed the screams through the forest, branch after branch hit my face, and the air began to grow colder and colder. The time was now 7:34 and had reached a clearing. The moment I entered the clearing, I spotted it. A man with a disfigured face and disgusting eyes. It had been as if someone had taken a knife to this man's face and cut off anything that would make him look human. He looked at me with a grin I won't forget for years to come. I stared back and dropped my gaze to the floor where there lay Jacob. Pierced through his stomach, blood covered the damp dirt on the ground. When I looked back up, the man was gone. Had fixated my gaze on my poor Jacob so heavily that I hadn't even noticed him leave. I ran to Jacob, tears streaming down my face. Looking into his lifeless eyes, all Yel could think is that I could have done something to prevent this. I could have kept him inside. His cold, lifeless body lied on the ground, and as the sun finally set, I heard my dad's voice ring in my head. It was a dark and stormy night. That was my last ever experience with that thing. It took Jacob's life, and ever since I've been protecting my family, absolutely insisting that they come home before 7:30. I haven't seen it again, but the thought that one day I might still lurks in the back of my mind. I'm going to start the story by saying that you should always be careful when running, even if it is in a popular place, or even if you have ran the trail a dozen times. It's always important to be aware of your surroundings. When I was in high school, was an active runner. I would run every day after school, which allowed me to clear my head, or just to get some clarity on things I had to decide. I had ran track on and off since middle school, so I could keep a good pace while running distance, and even could run a pretty decent mile. This story takes place around the time I was a senior in high school, so there was a lot on my mind. Things like which college I was going to attend, or which colleges I could even get into, etc. Everything was changing pretty fast, and the amount of stress I had from school had finally gotten to me, so Elle had decided that Elle would go running in a park after school one day, just to give myself some time to think. The park was a pretty popular place. It had some really great trails, and it helped it wasn't far off from my house, so I ran there pretty often. I always had felt safe while running in the park, as I saw lots of people I knew and often always saw someone on the trails. There were some undeveloped areas you could run for some good scenic views where you could sometimes see deer and other animals. When I had gotten to the park, there were people there, but it wasn't as busy as usual, which didn't bother me as I had a lot on my mind and needed some time to run and just think. I did all of the things I usually did, like stretch, and got ready to enter the woods. I put my headphones in, and the second I did, I blurred everything else out. I had started up my run with a nice light jog and passed some people and smiled like normal until there was a man who greeted me with a smile that was extremely unsettling. If I had to describe it, I would say imaging someone is looking down and they smile with no teeth while bringing their eyes up like in the movie Smile. It was creepy, but I nodded and waved like I normally would. I tried not to pay too much attention to the man and kept running as I was at a public park, and it wasn't unusual to see people. I had maybe ran a few laps around the common park area and kept passing the man in the same area, which struck me as weird as I had ran laps and not little ones either, like laps that took 5-8 minutes. Every time I would pass, would politely nod and keep running. After a while, though, I started to think more and more about the situation. I began wondering why the man hadn't moved much from the original area I saw him in. At this point, I started seeing less and less people on the main trails, and it became later in the afternoon. The sun was covering in the clouds, and although it hadn't set, it was getting darker and gloomy, as if a storm were coming. It was late April, so it was hot and rainy pretty frequently, and I decided that I would run a little bit longer until it started to rain. Then I would head back to my car. I ran past the main parking lot and noticed that my car was the only car parked in the lot, so I knew I was alone and figured everyone knew the rain was coming and decided to leave. I ran toward the entrance and re-entered the running paths, passing the original place. I had saw the man, and he was gone. I slowed down, catching my breath, and walked slightly for a few minutes, deeper and deeper in the trail. I was gathering my thoughts when I felt the feeling of being watched. I took my headphones out, and when I did, the park was silent, scary silent. You couldn't hear trees blowing in the wind or cars from the main road. You could only hear the sound of my breath and the music blasting from my headphones. I looked around and didn't notice anything, so I kept walking, this time remaining vigilant as I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I was walking, I had my head down, and when Elle brought it up, I noticed the man from earlier walking in my direction, except this time, he wasn't smiling. He looked agitated, so I didn't even bother to smile or wave. I kept my head down but noticed he was in jeans, boots, and a long-sleeve shirt, something I hadn't noticed earlier. It wasn't unusual for someone to be wearing that, but it was in the low 80s and humid from rain days prior, so I knew he had to be hot. I kept walking for a minute, hoping that I was in the clear, and when I made it probably 20 feet away, I turned around to see where he had went, and to my surprise, he turned around also, walking in my direction. I picked up my pace a little and started jogging, leaving my headphones out this time. Every step took, I heard more behind me. I glanced back and noticed the man jogging as well. I thought to myself, jogging in jeans, boots, and a long sleeve. I was so deep into the trail, though, that I was equidistant to both the start and finish, and if I kept going, that I would loop around to my car without having to turn around. But every step took me deeper and deeper into the woods, further away from the main road, and although it seems dumb, I knew I could not have ran past the man if he was planning on doing something I didn't want to find out. I had close to a mile left on the trail, but every time I would pick up the pace, so would he. I kept hoping that he would stop to take a breath, but he never did. I tried to rationalize it, but I couldn't, especially since every time I picked up the pace, he was quick to as well. The area was much darker now, and the rain had started pouring. I was now drenched, and as I took a look back, the man was even closer than before. He was gaining on me, and I knew that I had to make a fast decision, so Elle went for it in hopes that if he was following me, he wouldn't calculate my next move. I was approaching a scenic dip off trail that had been overgrown and covered by leaves and sticks, leading downward on a slope like a tall hill. People had stopped running down it because of how steep it was, but it cut right down the main loop, saving probably 1/3 of the remainder. At this point, the only people who really knew about it were the people who had ran it before it became overgrown. I picked up my pace as fast as I could, running straight forward on the main path, and covered my face with my arms, cutting a sharp left running through the twigs, vines, and leaves. I heard an audible gasp, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. I ran down the hill as fast as I could, hoping that I had made a right decision, too afraid to look back until reached the bottom of the hill. I had put a good distance between us, and when I turned around for the last time, there he was standing at the top of the hill, looking down at me, breathing heavily, looking annoyed and angry, like he was on the verge of a psychotic break. He was breathing heavily, covered in rain, and just staring at me with such anger. I didn't stick around and ran as fast as I could toward my car, hoping that when I got to my car, the story would end there. But when I approached my car, I quickly jumped into it, pulling out of the parking lot as fast as I could. I looked in the rear view, noticing the man on the edge of the woods, staring, and it immediately sent chills down my spine, as there were no other cars in the parking lot. I was shaking the whole car ride home, and was too afraid to tell my parents because if they knew, they wouldn't let me run again, and that was my only form of solitude. I laid in bed all night in fear, thinking about his unsettling smile and how creepy he was. I thought about how I should have known something was wrong sooner. I finally fell asleep after replaying all of the scenarios in my head and was woken up at 3 a.m. by my stepdad, who had just gotten home from work. I heard him enter the house in a panic, screaming for me, and when I sat up, he came into my room asking if I was okay, and when I asked why, he pointed outside. I quickly went outside to see my car door opened, and my car had been gone through, seats slashed and a busted back window. I was confused as nothing had been stolen, but just to destroy my car was strange. I started thinking about who would do something like that or why. We lived in a secluded area with only 2 neighbors, which lived far enough from us to allow us to be loud and have gatherings, but close enough to run to in case of an emergency, so nobody had heard anything. Aside from the glass and cut seats, the only thing sitting on my seat was my registration. It suddenly dawned on me that when I had ran to my car earlier that day, that I jumped straight in and took off. I didn't unlock my car. It was older, so it had to be manually locked and unlocked with a key, but I didn't unlock it. I knew it had to be the man from earlier. He must have looked at the registration and gotten my name and address from it. I moved to college shortly after, and my family sold the house when I was in college. But it still makes me wonder what else he would have done if he would have gotten me, or even worse, broken into my house. When it rains in the woods, to be honest with you, I'm terrified of rain. I never leave the house when it's storming outside. But to give myself some credit, I never used to be like this. I used to love watching the rain fall from outside the windows, but now I always have my curtains pulled tight across the edges of the windowsill. I wish I could show you what made me the way I am, partly to warn you, partly to verify myself. I can only write out my story like it's some sort of fantasy, as if it's just another bizarre story on the internet that deserves to be forgotten in a week. If you see it like that, then that's fine, but I won't forget. I'll never forget. In 2012, one was a 21-year-old college student. I was absolutely madly in love with nature and all things wild. I had spent my childhood roaming up and down tree lines, fantasizing about mythical creatures and fantastic monsters. Now there I was in 2012 as an adult, studying forestry with dreams of defending those tree lines and fantasies I held so dear. I was absolutely ecstatic when my professor announced an opportunity for some extra credit. He suggested that we spend a few days of our upcoming break walking along some trails and paths to remind ourselves why we were doing what we were doing. As an avid hiker, I knew of a hiking trail a few hours over from our town that offered plenty of room to walk with very little crowding. The only ones who really walked more than a few minutes down the trail were the park rangers, and the chances of seeing one of them on the ever-winding and expanding trails of the forest seemed small. "Hey, Lily, want to take a trip down to the preserve with me?" I asked as the bell finished tolling, signaling the end of the school day. The girl next to me, Lily, was a quiet and sweet girl. She had long brunette hair that stretched just past her shoulders and gentle green eyes. She was the type of person who people admired from afar, beautiful but silent. A passing joke or compliment would make her smile, but she'd very rarely comment back. To most, that'd make them move on to the next person. To me, that made me want to be closer to her. We'd been friends for a while at this point. Whether or not any sort of romantic intent was had between us, couldn't say. We just knew we connected on some sort of level. "Yeah, of course. Just tell me when." She looked into my eyes with the soft smile on her face. I smiled back at her. I hoped this trip would turn out well. A few days passed. Lily and I spent our free time in stores, gathering food, supplies, and tents together. Soon enough, we were all packed up and ready to head out. We took my small car with our bags tied down on the roof and took the highway a few hours east. By the time we got there, it was mid-afternoon, Still plenty of time to walk, but also a bad time to find parking. There was plenty of people here walking their dogs, setting up lunches, and walking the paths. "I thought you said it'd be quiet," Lily asked with a slight snicker. I rolled my eyes in response. "I'm sure these kids aren't planning on hiking a few days in. It'll get quiet, I promise." I spun around and began taking our large packs off of the roof of the vehicle. For as big as they were surprisingly easy to carry. Lily slipped the straps over her shoulders and waited for me to start heading towards the park. As we approached the trail's entrance, we saw a ranger loosely standing guard. "You guys heading in?" he asked. There was no hostility or caution in his tone. He was just merely asking a simple question. "Yeah, that's all right, right?" I questioned the fit, middle-aged man. "Of course, just let me know your names and take my card. If you need anything, call down to the station. There's a couple ranger shacks deeper in. Feel free to use them if you need to, just make sure to clean up." The ranger gave a welcoming smile and handed me a small business card for the local ranger station. "Thank you. Oh, and my name's Max. This is Lily." Lily gave a small nod at the ranger, and he nodded back respectfully. "Well, Max and Lily, you enjoy yourselves out there. We'll be patrolling around, so if you see us, don't be scared to say hi." With those words, the ranger backed away from the entrance, and we began our trek. We spent half of the first day slowly walking in quiet appreciation. There's something so liberating about walking with no time limit. It's like all of the world's stress slides right off your back, and the only thing you have to worry about is yourself. In that exact moment, you're all that matters. No bills, no studies, no cares. Just avoid snakes and strange plants, and you're all set. It wasn't too long into our journey before the sun began to nestle itself behind the trees, and the warm but steadily dropping temperature of the late afternoon winds began sweeping under our sweaty clothes. "Let's find a clearing to settle into," Lily said, her head tilting from one direction to the other, looking for a place to set up. I nodded in approval and saw a small opening further down the path, clearly made by others who took a similar trip. It only took a few minutes to set up our tents in the clearing and to start a small fire. After all that walking and hard work, we were finally ready to be off our feet for a while. Lily plopped herself down on the opposite side of the fire Elle was sitting at and pulled out a granola bar to eat. I felt a rumble in my stomach and pulled out one of my own. "This place is really beautiful," she said, taking a large bite out of the bar. Yeah, haven't seen many animals yet though, ooh." I unwrapped my food and placed it on my lips, ready to take a bite. I quickly glanced over at Lily and froze. In the increasingly darkening forest just off the trail, just behind Lily, was something about the size of half a football. It was cloaked in the darkness, but I assumed it had to have been some sort of small critter. I began to squint my eyes, trying to focus on it, but whatever it was seemed to fade out of existence, going straight into the ground. "Everything all right?" Lily asked. I realized it must have seemed like I was staring at her with food half in my mouth. I laughed and shrugged, shaking my head softly. "Yeah, sorry, I thought I saw an animal or something off in the woods. It was small, could have just been a rabbit or something. It must have burrowed into the ground, though." My friend peered over her shoulder into the silent woods and looked around. I knew she wouldn't see anything. Whatever it was left as quickly as I caught sight of it. We ended up finishing our meal, extinguishing the fire, and climbing into our separate tents. I slept like a log. All of that walking put me out like a light. It wasn't until the morning that I woke up. I stumbled out of the tent, nearly tripping on the small fabric ledge at the exit of my portable shelter. The hot and humid summer's morning sun hit like a pile of bricks. Just so you know, I think we need to watch out for snakes, Lily said softly while I was wiping my brow. I looked over at her to see her undoing the tent supports from the forest floor. Did you see one? Elle asked, bending down and following suit with the camp cleanup. I think so. I heard something rubbing on the bottom of my tent last night. I opened my eyes and the indents on my walls looked like a pretty thick snake trying to wiggle its way in. She didn't seem bothered by the potential late-night visitor, so I kept her warning in my mind but continued on. As our journey went on, we realized that every step we took there was another blotch in the sky. Somehow a storm was brewing overhead that none of the forecasts we had watched warned us of. "Oh, Carl, how much longer until it rains?" Lily was interrupted by a large thunderclap nearby in the clouds. I felt the earth tremor below us before a few raindrops began falling from the dimly lit sky. "Thanks, Lily," I said, arching my head towards her direction. She scoffed and I laughed. The rain was little more than a small drizzle at that moment, but it was clear it was going to get worse. "Let's hurry and find a place to set up." I watched as she began to increase her pace, slowly moving from a walk into a jog, heading deeper down the trail. I followed suit right next to her. For a while, it seemed like we weren't going to find a clearing anytime soon. We were already on the verge of being considered undoubtedly drenched, and to our luck, at that exact moment of thought, another strong explosion of thunder erupted from above. This time the floodgates were opened. Rain began to fall with a purpose, and with enough force to erupt on impact, splashing everything nearby with the drop's watery contents. "Hey, right over there!" I heard Lily yell out, just barely audible through the thunderous rain. She was running off of the main path down a small side trail nearby. I looked at where she was heading and saw a small cabin. I ran off the path with her. With each step, more and more mud thrust itself against my legs. I increased my speed, hoping to catch up to my light-footed friend, but something caught me off guard. The tip of my foot slid underneath something, and my momentum carried me downwards, face first, into a mud bath. For a few seconds I was dazed, just laying down in the runny muck pit. I eventually looked down to my feet and saw what looked like a thin tree root, also caked in dirt, erupting out of the ground. But as my eyes kept on the root, those initial assumptions fell to the wayside. The shimmering of the mud is what made me realize that whatever this object was, it was moving just beneath the mud. Then it clicked in my head. The snakes Lily had brought up. I had just tripped over one of them. I felt a shiver cross over my back, and I jolted back up to my feet and continued on my path, abandoning that snake behind. Without another incident, Lai made it to the cabin doors and busted inside, finally free from the hurricane-like storm. "Wow," a familiar voice rang out in the shack. I looked over to see a drenched but otherwise clean Lily staring at me with an amused smile on her face. "Decide to have a wrestling match out there?" "Ha ha, funny," I said, looking down at myself. Mud was dripping off of just about every pore of my body. "Think I met one of your snakes you mentioned out there. It decided to give me a little trip." "Oh, really?" Lily said as she grabbed me and turned me around, searching the pack on my back for something to help me clean up. "You were right, they're pretty thick. I wonder what kind they are. I can't imagine them being venomous, being that wide." Felt the hands of my companion yanking out fabric from my pack. I took some time to look around the cabin as Lily pulled the towels free. It was wooden, old, and completely empty. There was a cooking stove off to one side, but other than that it looked very sparse. Clearly it was only meant for a quick one-night stay. "Here, get yourself cleaned up." I turned back around and Lily handed me a bundle of towels. I immediately wiped off my face and brow. The dirt was already starting to dry and stick to my skin. "Thanks," I replied to her as she began setting up her things. I put my pack down against the door and walked over to a window, still wiping myself down. I watched as the rain continued its assault on the earth, the dirt running like rivers down the valleys and trails both natural and man-made. "It looks terrible outside," I remarked. I heard a small groan of acknowledgement come from behind me. I let my eyes trail over the forested wetland over to the path we took to get up here. My body locked up when I saw something right where I tripped. Something was protruding from the ground like a small pillar. I rubbed the inside of the window fruitlessly to clear off the fog and obstructing rain. I could barely make out what looked like a thick, partially submerged branch, broken off on one end with small twigs splintering off skyward. "Hey, come and look at this," I called out to Lily, who was still fondling around with her bags. "LS the snake?" she asked, rising to her feet. "I don't think so. It looks weird, though." I watched the mud-coated object get hammered by rain as Lily approached and peered outside. "LS, that a broken tree root?" she suggested. I could only shrug. Whatever it was wasn't moving. "Wait," Lily chimed in again. "Look at the color." As more and more of the rain ran its way down the object, the less obstructed by mud the object became. I narrowed my eyes, pushing past the raindrops on the window, and noticed exactly what Lily was talking about. Whatever was under that mud was a pale shade of gray. "Oh my God!" Lily gasped and grabbed her mouth. "What is it?" I turned and looked at her, my eyebrow upturned in confusion. "Look at the end of it," she said, holding her breath. I turned my gaze back outward and focused in. I felt my heart drop. It was an arm reaching out of the ground, still as the grave. "Oh my God!" My voice wavered slightly. "We should call the rangers and get them out here." "Where's their card?" she asked, hand extended towards me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a wet but legible business card. Without hesitation, Lily snatched it out of my hand and began dialing the number in. "Hello, I'd like to report something on one of the trails." She paced back and forth on the squeaky cabin floors. I turned and kept my gaze on the hand. It looked petrified in place, fingers eagerly reaching towards the sky, letting the water rush over it. She began to stutter. "We're at here." I heard the voice on the other side of the phone chirp up, and Lily nodded. "Hey, Max, can you take a step outside and tell me what number's next to the door?" I peeled my eyes away from the hand. I felt an increasingly oppressive air pressing its way inside the cabin. I shook my intuition away and walked to the door. I opened it up and stepped outside. I peered towards the arm and could see it more clearly without the blurry window between us. It was hairless, smooth, and the fingernails seemed clean and trimmed. The water that gushed over it almost seemed to vanish on impact, as if it was some sort of sponge. I had to force my eyes away from it to view the number on the wall. I took a deep breath, repeating the number in my head before the sound of a loud clap echoed off behind me. I jumped slightly on edge. I turned back towards the direction of the arm and saw nothing in its place, just the mud quickly running down the trail. I swallowed hard and rushed back inside. "The number's 17, but I think the arm fell back into the mud. It's not there anymore." Lily's eyes went wide as she relayed that information over to the dispatcher. It wasn't long until she pulled the phone away from her ear and hung up. "They told us to stay put and that this storm's not going to pass anytime soon. They said they've got a ranger on the way, and the police have been informed, but it might take them a while to reach us out here." T bit my lip and looked back outside towards the empty path. "Hope it didn't get dragged away by the current," I mumbled. Lily came up right beside me, joining me at the window. "I'm sure they'll be able to follow that mud slick down to wherever it goes. On the bright side, that rain cleaned you up a bit." She gave a reassuring smile, and I looked down at myself. My clothes were still riddled with mud, but the rain on my skin seemed to have washed away most of the dirt. One guess that's always a plus, I said stoically. Come on, Max, let's make ourselves at home at least. I'll just lock the door in case, well, you know. Her voice trailed off. In case there's a killer out there, I mumbled at her as she walked over to the door and flipped the lock. She turned around and averted her eyes from my gaze, choosing instead to continue her mission of getting set up. After a few minutes of silence, we had our food laid out in front of us. We had agreed that once the ranger gets here, our little expedition was over. We had seen more than enough in just the past 2 days than we could have in a lifetime. Let's eat and try to get some sleep, I said, chowing down on some extra rations. Lily nodded and joined in on the feast. With full stomachs, we set up for bed. I noticed my friend kept looking out towards the darkened windows. I could feel tension in the air. Everything all right? I asked. Lily shook her head dismissively. Just feel weird, like I'm being watched. I'm sure it's nothing but just to be safe. She ripped off her pillowcase, then mine, before walking over to the windows and draping them over the glass as makeshift curtains. One just don't want anything looking in at us while we sleep. I don't blame you. I made my way to my bedroll and caseless pillow before lying down, trying to get comfortable. Lily did the same. It was a few hours into the night before Elle heard Lily's hushed voice. Max, wake up. Do you hear that? I opened my eyes less groggy than Elle expected and met Lily's gaze. She was staring at the wooden door of the cabin. I spent a few seconds watching the door before Elle lightly saw the handle of the door jiggle. Someone was trying to get in. What do we do? Lily asked. I was speechless. Maybe it's the... Our whispered conversation was interrupted by a loud knocking, coming from the other side of the wooden door. It's got to be the cops. I began my slow, meticulous walk to the door. Who's out there? Hello? I yelled again. Abruptly, the banging started again, loud enough to drown out my voice. I took a step back from the door and kneeled close to the ground. Each impact on the door rocked the wooden frames of the small cabin. I watched as one of the pillowcase curtains began to slowly slip off the window. No, Lily whispered, tears in her eyes. Rooshed over to the window just as the fabric fell and was met face to face with the darkness outside. The banging on the door stopped suddenly. I very carefully kneeled down and grabbed the fabric in my hands to toss back over the window. Appearing out of the darkness was the palm of a hand. It slapped the window with a heavy force. I could only see the pale palm in the shroud of blackness outside. I quickly threw the pillowcase back on the window and backed up to Lily. She was shivering, her eyes wide with fear. That was the hand, Max. That was the hand that was outside earlier. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. I wrapped my arms around Lily for as much my comfort as hers. Thud, 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 thud. The wet palm of the hand kept slapping against the glass. I could hear ripples of cracks spreading along the window pane. I squeezed onto Lily as she balled up and kept my eyes focused on the pillowcase covering the glass, hoping it wouldn't fall and expose that lifeless arm again. With one last thud, it stopped. A light shone through the fabric of the window mere seconds after the attack halted. Elle could hear the struggling sounds of wheels rolling up towards the cabin. I let out a sigh and a prayer that the Rangers had finally made it. With the sounds of the wheels stopping just a few yards away, I finally heard a voice call out from the void outside. Lily, Max, you in there? The voice sounded familiar. It was the Ranger from the day prior. I slid to my feet, dragging Lily with me. Yeah, we're inside, but someone's out there, I yelled. I rushed over to the door and opened it to see the Ranger standing stiff off in the middle of the small opening in front of the cabin. He was facing us, but the light from his rover, coupled with his hat, covered his body in intense shadows. His body seemed rigid. "Come out of that box and we'll get you home," the ranger said. His voice seemed different this time, disjointed from his body. "Oh," I stayed quiet. Something was eerie wrong here. "Step out of there, now," the voice grumbled, unrecognizable from earlier. "Are you all right?" I called out, a little more than a whisper. "Of course, Salam. Can't you see my smile?" The ranger tilted his neck backwards. His hat slipped from his skull, which allowed the light from behind him to illuminate his face. His eyes were wide and full of both pain and fear. His lips were quivering in shock. Backed up more into the doorway and watched as two impossibly long fingers trailed their way from behind the ranger's head and made their way across his cheeks to his mouth. They slid inside with little resistance and began pulling his lips outward in a mockingly gruesome smile. I watched as his lips strained with the force of the fingers inside of his mouth. His lips became white with the stress placed against them, before a shower of red erupted from his mouth, parting the centers of his lips like sliced meat. "I'm so perfectly happy," a voice called out from just behind the ranger, its voice thick and unnatural. I looked for the source and froze. There, right next to the ranger's feet, was a half-submerged human face dug deeply into the mud. Its black, cold eyes shone from some unknown source. Whatever this was a monster of the strictest definition. Its gaze was so vastly separated from humanity that there was no common ground between us. As I locked eyes with this thing, human in shape and deviled in eyes, I saw the ranger fall into the mud. Just behind his head was a long spider-like arm, stretching out of the ground, seemingly changing its size and shape as if it only faintly followed the laws of this reality. The ranger's body twitched and spasmed on the ground as more and more lifeless hands began to slither out from the mud, wrapping their hands around his body. "I was so thirsty, but now I'm so very hungry," the submerged head called out unblinkingly towards me. Without another warning, the ranger's body was ripped under the earth and devoured by the mud. The ground where he was shifted and bubbled over like a small eruption. The creature's eyes stared at me with a deadening gaze. It was observing me. I let out a small chirp from my mouth. Without changing expression, the head effortlessly started gliding through the earth towards the cabin, fingers and arms popping out from the earth around it like fins from a shark. I had stored enough courage to slam the door shut and lock it before running back over to Lily, who saw the whole thing. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head and slumped down next to her. We sat in silence until the sounds of scratching came from below the floorboards. Hundreds of fingers tearing away flesh to the bone, trying to burrow their way upwards. All we could do was sit in the corner furthest away from the windows and pray they didn't get to us. That night we watched as the floors pulsated upwards and downwards as the foundation began to crumble. Those arms were going to drag us and our wooden coffin downwards into the earth. I sat waiting to die, but Lily had other plans. She grabbed my hand and yanked me up my feet. She stared at the door for a split second before sprinting off with me in tow. She bursted open the door and ran towards the ranger's vehicle. Luckily for us, the ranger never shut it off before the earth took him down. We both hopped on its seat and zipped off the path back from where we came. T hazarded a glance back towards the cabin to see it crumbling into the ground, but there was something else there. Still half submerged on the path mere yards away from us was that unblinking head. Its black eyes shone dead set and emotionless on our escape. We kept driving and driving for God knows how long, until we hit some other rangers who were on a scouting mission up to us and their missing comrade. We told them everything we could, but the looks of disbelief said enough to us. We were labeled as emotionally distressed and unreliable witnesses. The powers that be listed the disappearance of the ranger and the cabin as accidental by case of mudslide. Now every time it rains, I wonder if somewhere out in the woods, a single head peers out on the trails waiting for someone to pass by, a million hands waiting just below the surface to drag them down into the earth. This was just one of many true horror stories. If you think you're ready for the next nightmare, subscribe now. And remember, some stories don't end when the podcast does.